Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging. Apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View starts right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Thank you for joining me today here on Point of View. A little bit later this hour, we're going to be talking with Laurie Cardoza-Moore, and she is going to be talking about some of the attempts that have been made to try to marginalize the nation of Israel through various things like boycotts or disinvestment or even sanctions. And so we'll be talking with her by phone a little bit later this hour. Second hour, we'll get into a very important issue that I think is relevant to the persecution of Christians today. By the way, while I mention Israel, later in the week we will have Avi Lipcomb in studio. We'll be talking about Israel again, but did want to, in the first half hour here, spend some time talking about a couple of other issues in the news. But before we do so, wanted to talk about this idea of the culture war. This weekend, there was a conference where a number of people were speaking, and one of those was Tim Wildman of the American Family Association. And since it was nearby, I went over to say hi to him. We talked for a while. And then I heard his talk, and after hearing his talk, I thought, he had some really good points in his talk that I might put in a commentary. And so I was planning on doing that. And then when I saw a commentary today by our friend Robert Knight on the very same topic, I thought, no, I think I'll do it right now and focus on whether it is time to pull out of the culture war. Now, in his talk, Tim Wildman was talking about a lot of different things. Matter of fact, it had, and he's kind of a humorous, great title. We don't need no ignorant Christians, is kind of the title of it. English teachers kind of grimaced when he said it that way, but nevertheless, he was getting into all sorts of topics. But one of them was the culture war. And near the end of his talk, he quoted from Pat Buchanan. Pat Buchanan's been on our program before. He's been a presidential speechwriter. He's been a presidential candidate, but most importantly, a columnist. And it was such a great quote, I went and found it and realized Pat Buchanan wrote this 16 years ago, but it's as relevant as today. I'm going to read a little bit more from it than Tim Wildman did, but you'll see that it really is relevant to some of the despair that people are feeling right now. I don't know what it is about the Supreme Court decision on same-sex marriage, because we've had many other decisions on all sorts of other topics that could cause people to maybe feel like it's time to give up. But that one seems to have really struck a chord and caused a lot of people to say, maybe it's just time that we just drop out of this whole debate about the issues. We no longer need to contend for our values and the rest. Tim Wildman has a great question. He says, are we supposed to obey the laws? And everybody says, sure. Well, why? Well, Romans 13, 1-7. Okay, so Christians are to obey the laws. Okay, next question then. Do you want to leave all those laws to people who are not Christians? Does that make any sense to you, that you want people that aren't Christian to make the laws that Christians then have to obey? And of course, as soon as you start thinking about that, you realize even if we are recognizing that the primary answer to all the problems we talk about here on Point of View is the preaching of the gospel, if we are in a culture where the gospel cannot be preached, where various churches and ministers are affected in a very detrimental way, if indeed we are forced constantly in a culture that is no longer Christian to have to question whether or not we obey the law or obey God, and whether we have to exercise civil disobedience, you can see why it's important for us still to be the salt of the earth and the light of the world. Well, anyway, 16 years ago, Pat Buchanan wrote a piece called Why We Can't Quit the Culture War. I'll skip down to the fourth paragraph, and we could post this if you'd like to read it, but it is an older column, but it's as relevant as some of the things that have happened today. By the way, even so, I did post a more recent column by Pat Buchanan, which we'll get into in just a minute. But he said, is the culture war over? Has our culture become so debased that conservatives have no choice but to secede? To answer those questions, we must ask first, at its original and deepest level, what is the culture war all about, and who are the contending forces? Now we come to the quote that Tim Wildman used, and I thought it was really powerful, because he says, ultimately, our culture war is about one question. Is God dead, or is God king? For centuries, the issue has been crucial. If God is dead, as Nietzsche, he's talking about Friedrich Nietzsche, wrote, everything is permissible, and eventually one will logically reach the conclusion of the Paris student radicals of 1968. The only thing that is forbidden is to forbid. So there's the first point. You know, if God is dead, then, yeah, you can't say anything is wrong because that would be a moral judgment. The only thing that is forbidden is to forbid. Recognize he wrote this 16 years ago. Does that sound like the kind of questions we have today with political correctness and multiculturalism? So the first question, if God is dead, then everything is permissible and you can't really say anything is wrong. But if God is king, men have a duty to try, as best they can, to conform their lives to his will and shape society in accordance with his law. Defection and indifference are not options open to us. We are commanded to fight. A little bit later in the column that he wrote, again, 16 years ago, he said, we cannot quit. We can no more walk away from the culture war than we could walk away from the Cold War. For the culture war is at the heart a religious war about whether God or man shall be exalted, whose moral beliefs shall be enshrined in law, and what children shall be taught to value and abhor. With those stakes, to walk away is to abandon your post in time of war. And after reading that over the weekend and then finding this morning this piece by Robert Knight, who's been on the program with us many times before and has certainly been with Concerned Women for America, and he's been, of course, writing for the Los Angeles Times and now as a fellow with the American Civil Rights Union and also writes for the Washington Times. He said, you know, with all the calls to conservatives to give up on the culture, the only thing lacking is a drone riding witch over the Statue of Liberty skywriting "Surrender, Dorothy." He's having a little bit of fun there. He started right on cue following the Supreme Court's demolition of marriage. The New York Times conservative David Brooks said it's time to move on and leave cultural, political issues in the dust. He said, first, he accurately diagnosed the situations. This is now quoting from David Brooks of the New York Times. David Brooks said, more and more Christians feel estranged from mainstream culture. They fear that they will soon be treated as social pariahs, the moral equivalent of segregationists, because of their adherence to scriptural teaching on gay marriage. They fear their colleges will be decertified, their religious institutions will lose their tax-exempt status, their religious liberty will come under greater assault, unquote. And so, of course, Robert Knight agrees with that. He says, then, of course, David Brooks offers this solution. Consider putting aside in the current climate the culture war. In other words, Robert Knight says, leave the public square to radicals who are creating a government and culture openly hostile to anyone holding traditional values. Maybe they won't hit you if you keep your head down. Of course, we quoted the other day from a piece that Mark Stein did talking about keeping your head down in the 1930s in Nazi Germany. How did that work out for everybody? Not so well. When we come back, I will read the rest of Robert Knight's column because he then takes us to Oregon, the conversation that we had over the weekend and certainly on the Friday program, and talk about how that illustrates this. And then I'll come back to the piece I've posted today by Pat Buchanan, A Coming Era of Civil Disobedience. But I think it is an important question to be asking at this time. We're going to probably hear more and more Christians say, you know, we've lost the culture. There's nothing we can do. And I recognize that the only way culture is reformed is by changing individual hearts that change individuals, and the gospel is key to that. But do we have a place to make sure that we have the right rules, regulations, and laws and judicial appointments so that we can live as Christians in freedom? I think that's a good question. We'll come back and talk more about that right after this.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
When Greece decided to default on its payment to the International Monetary Fund, there were all sorts of economic commentaries. As accurate as they were, they usually don't tell the whole story from a demographic perspective. Let me tell that story. Actually, I could say, let me retell that story. Some of my commentaries 5 years ago were predicting these events when you look at the fertility rate and the welfare state. The national fertility rate in Greece is 1.3 children per woman. Demographers point out that a country needs a fertility rate of 2.1 to replace its population. That used to be the fertility rate in the United States, which is now down to 1.8. No matter what policies you implement in Greece, you are faced with a demographic winter that has befallen the country. You can't provide generous government benefits when you have so many parents and grandparents who need to be supported by a smaller cohort of children. You end up with too few paying into the system while too many are taking from the system. Fertility is the only part of the problem. The generous Greek welfare state is another, which appears completely disconnected from reality. Columnist Mark Stein reminds us that originally in the Greek welfare system, you could retire at the age of 58. More than that, public sector workers often get off work at 2:30 p.m., which he says is like working 7 or 8 months out of a typical American work year. And the Greek system also pays well. Public sector workers receive 14 monthly payments. You know, when you begin to understand the demographics and finances behind the current Greek tragedy, it's easy to see why this country is facing so many problems. But we can't as a country say to ourselves, that's their problem, but it isn't our problem. Our fertility rate may be a little higher than theirs and our finances in much better shape than theirs, but it would be only a matter of time before we find our country in the same circumstances as Greece. All this could be just simply a preview of coming attractions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Let's open the phones in case you have some comments. 1-800-351-1212. Is it time to keep our head down and withdraw from politics, no longer encourage Christian men and women to run for office and to help construct some of those laws? Is it time to retreat, or is it time maybe to recognize that in this particular time, Christian values are needed even more so, and statesmen, individuals that can really articulate a Christian perspective are certainly deserving of office, and we certainly need to do what we can to make sure that other laws that are coming down and other judicial opinions coming down don't threaten religious liberty even more. Your thoughts, 1-800-351-1212. Quoted from Pat Buchanan, now I'm quoting from, again, Robert Knight, his piece today that appeared in the Washington Times, "The Danger of Complacency. Surrendering the culture wars to the secularist is not the answer." And he makes the case that conscientious objection will cease to be an option, and he says the case in point is what is found in the state of Oregon. In the state of Oregon, you have Oregon's labor commissioner. His name is Brad Avakian, and Brad Avakian was not content to uphold a ridiculously punitive $135,000 fine against two former Christian bakery owners for emotional damages to a lesbian couple for not baking a wedding cake in 2013. He also issued a gag order. The individuals that we're talking about are Aaron and Melissa Klein of Sweet Cakes, and Melissa was ordered to cease and desist sharing any communication about their decision to decline the cake request. The Kleins, as he points out, who closed the bakery, never refused routine service to all customers. They declined only to service an event, a same-sex wedding, citing their Christian beliefs against abetting or celebrating sin. Thanks to the progressive minder Mr. Avakian, they can't even explain why this is different from serving up some cupcakes. And then after supporters raised about $109,000 on the GoFundMe account to defend the Kleins, the crowdfunding website shut down the page to appease the forces of, quote, tolerance. Kleins have since moved on to continuetogive.com. And of course, as we mentioned last Friday, also people have raised funds to help with the court case through Samaritan's Purse. But then Robert Knight goes on. He said, by the way, the aggrieved lesbians listed 178 damages they suffered for having to patronize another bakery, including, as we mentioned on Friday, loss of appetite and weight gain. As the Oregon case shows, progressives are increasingly resorting to the use of government power to stamp out resistance. Robert Knight reminds us that in the old Soviet Union, surviving churches were allowed to operate as long as congregants did not do charitable work or anything else beyond the closed doors. Absent a major correction, we're closing in on the Soviet reality. And here's the illustration he gives. On MSNBC, Democratic Senator from Wisconsin, Tammy Baldwin, explained the new, cramped version of the Constitution favored by New Age progressives. Quote, she said, certainly the First Amendment says that in institutions of faith, there is absolute power to, observe deeply held religious beliefs. I don't think it extends far beyond that, unquote. Robert Knight goes on to say, no, not beyond the church walls or inside your head. As Justice Samuel Alito acidly warned in the dissent on the same-sex marriage, I assume that those who cling to old beliefs will be able to whisper their thoughts in the recesses of their homes, but if they repeat those views in public, they will risk being labeled as bigots and treated as such by governments, employers, and schools, unquote. Meanwhile, we're told that political resistance is not only futile, but perhaps even unchristian. He says ordinarily reliable conservative columnist Cal Thomas recently rebuked his fellow evangelical Christians, citing the sins of the old moral majority. And he says he's right in one sense, because he said all too often Christians have been suckered by the Republican establishment only to face betrayal. But he says his advice was to simply live good lives, aid the poor, but as for politics, stay out of it. And he says he ensures that this isn't about surrender. Robert Knight disagrees. He said, well, with all due respect, yes, it is. It's music to the ears of secular elites who want a power monopoly. Although Christians were warned by Jesus that they would be at odds with the world, situations can vary immensely. Taking leave as outsiders might have made good sense in an authoritarian regime like ancient Rome, but America was created as a self-governing republic where we, the people, are Caesar. When people of faith shrug and let the God-hating secular left dominate the public square, they're not only being bad citizens, but as Edmund Burke noted, aiding the advance of evil. Sharing the gospel and actively engaging in citizenship are not mutually exclusive. Points out that even recent events should shake people from their complacency and spur them on to get more involved in public policy, not less. The moral majority twice helped elect Ronald Reagan. The complacent majority twice helped elect Barack Obama and may help elect Hillary Rodham Clinton. So some of the comments by Robert Knight. And again, I think for individuals that say, no, I'm not going to be in the political realm, that's fine. That is your calling. But I do believe that others might be called to a level of political participation and be able to make a difference in the community. And this is not a time, I think, to withdraw from it. Which brings me to the column I've posted today, just before we get into another topic and the next part of this hour. And that is the piece by Pat Buchanan. And it is interesting to quote from Pat Buchanan 16 years ago and Pat Buchanan from this weekend, the coming era of civil disobedience. And he's using the example of what has happened up there in Oklahoma. We've talked about this before. The Oklahoma Supreme Court ordered a monument of the Ten Commandments moved from the Capitol because they called the commandments religious in nature and an integral part of the Jewish and Christian faiths. And so that's the reason the court ordered it to go. Of course, the governor has refused. Oklahoma lawmakers instead filed legislation to let voters cut out of their constitution the specific article that the justices invoked. And so he goes on to talk about some of the battle taking place up there in Oklahoma. But he says only this time the rebellion is likely to arise from the right. Certainly, Americans are no strangers to lawbreaking. What else was our revolution but a rebellion to overthrow the centuries-old rule and law of the king and parliament and establish our own. U.S. Supreme Court decisions have been defied, and those which were defied have been lionized by modernity. Thomas Jefferson freed all imprisoned under the Sedition Act, including those convicted in court trials presided over by Supreme Court justices. Jefferson then declared the law dead. Some Americans want to replace Andrew Jackson on the $20 bill with Harriet Tubman, who defied the Dred Scott decision and the Fugitive Slave Acts and led slaves to freedom on the Underground Railroad. New England abolitionists backed the anti-slavery fanatic John Brown, who conducted the raid on Harper's Ferry that got him hanged but helped to precipitate a civil war. That war brought over whether 11 southern states had the right to break free of Mr. Lincoln's Union, as the 13 colonies did break free of George III's England. Millions of Americans with untroubled conscience, he says, defied the Volstead Act and imbibed alcohol and brought an end to prohibition, and in the Civil Rights era, defying laws, mandated segregation, and ignoring court orders demanding and banning demonstrations became badges of honor. Rosa Parks is a heroine because she refused to give up her seat on a Birmingham bus, despite the laws segregating public transit that relegated blacks to the back of the bus. And in his letter to the Birmingham jail, Dr. King defended civil disobedience, citing Augustine, "An unjust law is no law at all," and Aquinas, who defined an unjust law as a human law that is not rooted in eternal law and not natural law. So again, we have a long tradition of civil disobedience. We hope that Christians will not have to exercise that. But if nothing else, there's going to be a need for us to think through what this might mean when the government commands one thing and when the Bible commands something else. It wasn't difficult for the apostles in the first century when they were engaged in what? Evangelism, when they were preaching the gospel. They were commanded not to speak of that. And the answer in Acts 5:29 is, we will obey God rather than men. So those are just a couple of thoughts that I've had that surfaced in large part over the weekend, due in part to a speech by Tim Wildman, as well as a very interesting column written by Robert Knight, and of course one that we've just posted today for you by Pat Buchanan on civil disobedience. So those are just a couple of topics that we certainly will come back to perhaps at the end of the program, but just when we take a break, we're going to come back and talk about what is happening right now to the nation of Israel. Not only is Israel being condemned and criticized by so many European countries, there has been a movement not only in Europe, but now even among many churches and universities and others to begin to either boycott Israel or to disinvest from Israel, or in some cases to call for sanctions against Israel. So those are some topics we're going to be talking about in just a minute. Before we do so, let me encourage you to find a couple of resources that we have made available to you. My Viewpoints commentary today on Greece, which we might talk about a little bit later in the second hour. We have, of course, your action item, the First Amendment Defense Act. And today we're encouraging those of you perhaps that have never given to a Point of View before, but you appreciate what we're doing, but you're saying, I really don't have much to give. We're saying, if you could just give $5, that would be a way to begin to show your support for what we're doing. And as you go to our website, you'll see where you can sow $5 and help other individuals be positive influence by this program. Let's take a break. We'll come back with more right after this.
There is a big incentive to pay your electric bill. If you don't, you find yourself in the dark. But who pays to make sure you're educated on the key issues of the day, to bring you wisdom for life at work, at home, and in the culture, like you hear from guests here on Point of View? Who makes sure that our electric bill gets paid? You're way ahead of me, aren't you? That's right. You do. The truth is, if every listener this week gave just $5, we could pay our bills for about the next 3 years. Did you hear me? $5, 3 years. Now, perhaps you can give more. How about $50 or $500, maybe even more? But please, don't be the one who fails to send at least $5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Whatever amount you chip in, thank you for your gift. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
We're not going to focus on Israel. As a matter of fact, we're going to do that a couple of times this week. Matter of fact, we'll have an entire program on Wednesday dealing with some of the things happening in Israel right now, and we'll focus perhaps also on the treaty with Iran and all of the rest. But there's another aspect of this, and I wanted to educate you about this, and it has to do with what we call BDS, that is boycott, disinvestment, and sanctions. And so that's one issue I want to address. Also, sometimes there are in many of our textbooks a lot of kind of anti-Semitic or anti-Israeli kinds of things are sneaking in there as well. So that's why we wanted you to know a little bit more about proclaiming justice to the nations. And we bring to the microphone Laurie Cardoza-Moore, who's a leader, businesswoman, wife, a mother of 5, and founder and president of Proclaiming Justice to the Nations. She has really been about standing with the Jewish nation and the state of Israel. She's been a part of, in one way or another, hundreds and hundreds of films and video productions. Over the weekend, I had a chance to watch in its entirety Israel Indivisible, the case for the ancient homeland, and I would add some others, The Forgotten People, Christianity and the Holocaust, Focus on Israel, Lest We Forget, Disinformation, A Secret Strategy to Destroy the West, and much, much more. You perhaps have seen her on some television programs, perhaps have read her in World Net Daily or Front Page Magazine. So, Laurie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Kerby, thank you so much for having me on your program today.
I might mention that you are located in Tennessee. We have listeners in Tennessee, and one of the things that we posted there was how the Tennessee General Assembly became one of the state legislatures to condemn BDS. Explain a little bit more about that and the campaign that you're involved with.
Absolutely, and thank you again. And I want to encourage your audience, while they're listening to the program, if they're in front of their computer, they can go to our website at pjtn.org, and they can follow along, and we've got a page there dedicated to the textbooks and the BDS movement. But for your audience who are not familiar with BDS and what it stands for, which is boycott, divestment, and sanctions, it is an international anti-Israel, anti-Zionist propaganda campaign, and by extension, an anti-Jewish campaign or anti-Semitic. BDS calls for boycotting Israeli products, academics and cultural leaders. They're pressuring to stop companies from doing business with Israel and divesting from companies that do business with Israel. They're sanctioning Israel for its legitimate self-defense measures to protect Israelis of all ethnicities, including Christians who live in Israel, from terrorism, Hamas rocket and missile attacks, and suicide bombers. So essentially that's what it is. And what we did with the resolution, Kerby, our organization, Proclaiming Justice to the Nations mission, is to educate Christians about their biblical responsibility to stand with their Jewish brethren and defend the state of Israel, as is mandated in the Word of God. Paul tells us numerous times in the New Testament. There's also scriptures in the prophets that talk about God's love for Israel, and that Paul mentioned that God's gifts and calling to Israel were irrevocable. And one of the, or actually two scriptures that come to mind that are critically important for us as Christians today, especially watching what our government is doing with Iran, watching this administration and its policies, its anti-Israel policies. We as Christians are commanded by God to stand with our brethren. In fact, God told the prophet Joel in the latter days he was going to wipe out the descendants of, was going to wipe out the nations of the world because they were dividing up his land. And I say to my Christian brethren, which nation is leading the charge but the Judeo-Christian nation, the United States of America? There's also a quote in the book of Obadiah where God told the prophet, in the latter days, he was going to wipe out the descendants of Edom because they stood by while their brother Jacob was held in captivity and they did nothing. If there is ever a time, Kerby, for Christians to rise up to stand with our Jewish brethren and defend the state of Israel, it is today. And, you know, it's amazing. This is, you know, a lot of Christians look at everything, the events that are unfolding around the world, and even particularly here in the United States, and people are getting discouraged. And I try to encourage everyone to remember that God has put us on the earth at this time. He didn't bring us into the world 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. He brought us, who are alive today, into the world. He equipped us with all of the giftings that we have, because he knew that he would use those gifts and those talents for this generation. And if there was ever a time that we need to read our Bibles, we need to study, we need to pray, and then we need to take action by faith, it is today. We can either be like David, who ran right into the face of the enemy Goliath and say, "What can you do to me?" Or be like Joshua and Caleb when the 12 spies were getting ready to enter the land, and 10 came back with a negative report. But it was Joshua and Caleb that said, "We can take these giants." So too is it for us today. We need to stand on those promises, on those truths that are found in the Scriptures, and we need to take that stand today. And what better way to do it than with the nation of Israel? You know, Israel is sitting over there in the Middle East. They are constantly under terrorist threat. They have been attacked by all the nations, the majority of the nations of the world, and have been condemned. And, of course, now they're being accused of apartheid South Africa attacks against Palestinians, when the reality is that it is the Arabs who are attacking their own people. Israel, even in the last war that was fought back in the summer in Gaza, Israel goes to great lengths to try to protect the innocent people. They do a procedure which is tapping on the roof, where they're letting people in buildings know that building has been targeted for an attack, by a missile attack by the Israeli government, because they are harboring weapon systems and missiles in the basement of those buildings. Some of those buildings are apartment complexes. Some of them are hospitals. Some of them are schools. This is going on, and the world sits by while Israel is trying to defend itself. So as I said, this is the time for us to take a stand. So what we did was, in Tennessee, we adopted a resolution that was adopted majority vote. We had only one dissenting vote in the House, but we passed majority in the Senate and, like I said, majority in the House. And once this resolution passed, and essentially what the resolution says, it was condemning the BDS movement, not just the academic and the economic boycotts, but also what is happening on our college campuses. Many of your listeners may live in parts of the country like California, up in the Northeast, in New York, Massachusetts, or even in the Southeast, Florida, where there have been major anti-Semitic attacks against Jewish students and now Christian Zionist students. Why? Because they are choosing to stand with Israel. And so what we decided to do was, because we knew that most people in Tennessee were not familiar with BDS, so we decided to launch this resolution to educate the grassroots, the Christians, because Tennessee is the belt buckle of the Bible Belt, and most Christians do stand, they're in church on Sunday, they read their Bibles, they know what God's Word says with regards to standing with Israel. But most Christians are unaware of this problem that is growing on college campuses. So we decided to educate the grassroots. We decided to educate our state legislators, and when we sent out a press release to announce that we were introducing this resolution in our state legislature, there was an incident that had happened on Vanderbilt's campus. Now, we had not had any BDS incidents or Israel apartheid incidents on any of our university campuses up until this point. But that weekend, someone had spray-painted swastikas on the exterior of the A.E. Pi Jewish Fraternity building. They also got into the building, went down to the basement, and spray-painted a swastika on one of the basement doors, essentially telling the Jewish students on campus, you're not safe on this campus, and you're not safe in your buildings.
Let me jump in because we need to take a break, and when we come back, we'll continue our conversation. If you'd like some more information, we do have a link to her website, and you can click on the picture or go to pjtn.org, but we have a link there, and you can find out a little bit more about the BDS movement and what they're doing, as well as the petition to remove anti-Semitic and anti-Judeo-Christian textbooks from U.S. schools. We'll take a break, come back with more right after this.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Continue our conversation with Laurie Cardoza-Moore for just a few more minutes. And again, this is an organization known as Proclaiming Justice to the Nations. And those of you that are supporters of Nation of Israel, and I know there are so many in our listening audience, this is an organization you need to know about. And let me commend to you some of the videos that they have produced. Israel Indivisible, the Case for the Ancient Homeland. Just an outstanding video. It lasts more than an hour, interviews a number of people that have been on this program with us before and tells you the story. And even if you feel like you know the story of the beginning and the birth of the nation of Israel, you'll fill in some of those gaps with that very well done video. Also another one, The Forgotten People, Christianity and the Holocaust. Laurie, just before we get any further, let's give people some action items because we do have a lot of action-oriented individuals. And on your website, you have a place where people can say no to BDS, which stands again for boycott, disinvestment, and sanctions or divestment. And then the second one is a petition to remove some of the anti-Semitic, anti-Judeo-Christian textbooks from the schools. Given that we have a lot of people that would like to get involved, how can they do so? And also, can they learn from what happened in the Tennessee Assembly about what they could do in their own legislature?
Absolutely, and if they go to the website like you suggested and they join the fight to say no to BDS, we have 41 states now who we have heard from citizens who are interested in introducing this resolution to their legislature in their states, and we have 7 countries where individuals have contacted us to introduce the resolution in their parliaments. So this is just one example of one way of getting involved and taking a stand. Like I said, we have 41 states. The other issue is the textbooks. And, we wonder why our kids are so susceptible on our college campuses. Why do they fall prey to this garbage once they get there? Well, the reason being is because, Kerby, we are priming our kids before they ever get to the university. We have found, back in 2012, we had a parent come to us in Williamson County, and let me just tell you, as I mentioned previously, Tennessee is the belt buckle of the Bible Belt. Well, Williamson County is one of the top 10 most conservative, Republican, wealthiest counties in the country. So you would think, as a parent with kids in the school system, that we're going to have parents that are, or teachers that are going to be Judeo-Christian. Our school board is going to have that same makeup, and people are going to be concerned about propaganda and rhetoric, historically inaccurate information being presented to our children. Well, when this parent came to me, who was a member of my Bible study group for many years, she said, "You will never believe what we're teaching our children in Williamson County schools." She brought me the textbook, and Kerby, there was a quote in a human geography textbook, a Pearson human geography textbook, that basically legitimized Palestinians blowing themselves up in a Jerusalem restaurant because they were waging a war against Israeli government policies and army actions. And when I found that quote, we decided to launch a campaign, media and local, to remove that textbook from our local school district. As a result of our efforts, now this is all grassroots. These are all parents and citizens who got involved in this effort. So one person can make a difference. But as a result of our efforts, we were able to get Pearson Publishers, the largest textbook publishing company in the world, to concede and remove that quote from future editions. We were able to change the way Tennessee reviews and adopts textbooks, also incorporating more transparency, putting parents on that commission so that they could be there to evaluate the textbooks. And then the citizens rose up in Williamson County, and they threatened their school board, and they told them, if you do not remove these textbooks, we will remove you from office. And the next election cycle, when those school board members, when the even number school board members came up for re-election, each one of them that voted to keep the textbook was removed and replaced by another citizen, much like you and I, Kerby, who said, you know what, we're not doing this anymore. We are not going to sit by and allow these people to sit on school boards and continue to adopt and approve textbooks that are anti-Semitic, anti-Judeo-Christian. They're historically inaccurate. They violate our state and U.S. constitutions because they favor the establishment of one religion over all the others. And as a result, that campaign went nationwide after the story aired on Fox and Friends. It ran for about 2 weeks, and we started hearing from parents all over the country. And now we are talking to parents in states like Texas, Florida, Ohio, Massachusetts, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Illinois, Oregon, Washington State, and many others, many probably in your listening audience, who have said, I want to get involved. And Kerby, this is how we are going to take back this country. The Lord gave me a great strategy in the midst of it, and I call it the Nehemiah principle. But if we remember, when Nehemiah was given the authority to go back and rebuild the walls of Jerusalem, he went and evaluated the destruction first, and then he went to the leaders in front of districts, the leaders of districts and people who lived in front of sections of the wall, and he was able to convince the people to rebuild their section, not to worry about their neighbors. but to build their section, and they were able to rebuild the walls to protect the city in record time. The same is true about our school districts, about our counties, and about our states.
Yes.
That if we as individuals will take up this issue, one county, one district at a time, we can win this battle.
I might just mention for any listeners that are wondering about the name of that textbook, was called The Cultural Landscape, an Introduction to Human Geography. It also had a number of other errors, so I do want to alert our listeners to watch for that and to connect up. But one last time, just before we run out of time on this hour, again, there's a way in which people can find out more about what's called the BDS movement, boycott, divestment, and sanctions against Israel. There's also a petition where they can find out more about some of those textbooks. And I appreciate you standing firm, because it illustrates, again, what one person can do, and it illustrates what, again, when we collectively get together and begin to let our elected representatives know some of our concerns, what a difference it can make. And so you've made a difference in Tennessee, and I'm hoping today that people listening in 40 other states that listen to this broadcast can do the same. So, Laurie, thank you for joining us today here on Point of View.
Absolutely, Kerby. God bless you for giving me this opportunity, and thank you. You keep up the great work as well.
Again, you can go to their website. Just go to our website, pointofview.net, and we link to it, or else you can go to pjtn.org. Either way, and you can find out a little bit more. Let me really commend to you those videos. Just outstanding, great production values. And if you've always sort of wanted to know a little bit more about Israel, since there's always been this challenge as to whether or not they're interlopers or whether they're occupiers and all the rest, it is just a very well-produced video. Israel Indivisible. And, of course, one of the other ones on the Holocaust, and many more that you can find out about on the website, which we have linked to at our website, pointofview.net. Just before we run out of time in this first hour, let me again encourage you to take some action on some of these items. We give you lots of information. We empower you to take that information so that you can make a difference in your community. So that's what we're all about, and I hope that as you listen to our broadcast and go to our website and see our videos and go and find many of the articles, that you appreciate that. And one of the things we wanted to do is encourage some of you that maybe have never given and say, look, does my gift even make a difference? Yes, as you will hear in just a minute from Bob, if everybody gave $5, we'd be in good for years. I mean, it just doesn't take very much at all. But for those of you that maybe have never given to us before, think about maybe just sending a one-time gift. That's just a way of saying thank you for the information that you hear every single day, and we'd love to hear from you. When we come back, we're going to talk about the first genocide of the 20th century. Looks a little bit like what we're seeing today. Christians slaughtered in the first 20th century. We're seeing it in the 21st century.
If you've been a Christian for any length of time, no doubt you've heard about Jesus feeding thousands with a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. Jesus took something small and turned it into something big. Recently, someone here at Point of View made an interesting discovery. He did some math and figured out that according to the number of faithful listeners we have, if you and every other listener gave $5, it would help Kerby and the team bring you interviews and commentary for not 3 months, but 3 years. You heard me right. If every listener donates just $5, we'd pay what it costs to bring you this needed information for 3 years. And if you urge a friend to join you, you send 5, they send 5, well, you can imagine the impact. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221, Box 30, Dallas 75221. Send $5. Urge a friend to join you. Support Point of View. Point of View will continue after this.
I just thank God for y'all. I listen to you every day, truly. I wanted to thank y'all for everything you do each day to inform Christian families and our community about the things we can do, and just the way you're so informative. I listen to you daily and love you guys and appreciate you so much.
God bless you, Kerby, for keeping this show so on track and for the decades of wonderful help to this nation that Point of View has been. We're all big fans of your work, and we pray that God will just prosper it.
As a Christian, over the years that I've followed this program, I'm constantly challenged to be on guard and to evaluate what's going on. And if for no other reason, to protect the caliber and the truth of your programming, I need to participate and to back your program financially to ensure that the truth stays out there for people to hear, to view, and to be a part of.
This is Point of View Radio.
Hi, this is Kerby Anderson. You know, each day we take on the tough issues and provide a biblical perspective to them. The topics we cover are wide-ranging: apologetics, theology, prophecy, creation and evolution, intelligent design, marriage, family, child-rearing, the millennial generation, trends in society, politics, economics, business, religious liberty, the Constitution, public policy, foreign policy, military policy, tensions in the Middle East, abortion, homosexuality, pornography, sexual ethics, media, technology, history, and America's godly heritage. We talk about anything that affects your faith, your family, or your freedom. So don't go anywhere, because Point of View continues right now.
Across America, live. This is Point of View. And now, Kerby Anderson.
Second hour today, we're going to spend some time talking about the first genocide in the 20th century. Last hour, we did mention in passing the Holocaust, and of course, later on in the 20th century, we have the Nazi Holocaust, and of course, the killing of Jews and Gypsies and others. But we're now going to talk about the Armenian genocide or Holocaust. Took place in round numbers from about 1915, 1922. In particular, a very significant event during that time, and that is the fire in Smyrna. We'll get into that a little bit more in just a minute. But it is part of this new book called The Great Fire, One American's Mission to Rescue Victims of the 20th Century's First Genocide. It is written by Professor Lou Ureneck. He is professor of journalism at Boston University and actually directs the Business and Economics Journalism program. He has been a Nieman Fellow and also an editor in residence at Harvard University, written a number of other books in different areas. This one, I think, is somewhat unique to him. And Professor, thank you so very much for joining us today here on Point of View.
It's good to be with you. Thank you.
You know, I mentioned I think we've seen some of the books that you've written about the things I like: outdoors, hunting, fishing, those kinds of things. This is a little bit out of the ordinary, but in large part it was because of your interest in this reverend. And again, this shows the power of one individual, kind of the theme from last hour, interestingly enough, Reverend Asa Jennings. But maybe before we get into the book, let's give some people historical background. I hate to say it, but I would imagine even people that know a little bit about history probably don't know much about the Armenian genocide or the Armenian Holocaust, whatever you want to call it. And that, I think, gives us an understanding for the background for this book, doesn't it?
Yes, absolutely. You know, the Armenian genocide is somewhat known in the United States, not nearly as much as it should be, but some people are familiar with it. And classically, the Armenian genocide is bracketed in the years 1915 and 1916. And during that period, 1.5 million Armenian Christians were killed by the Ottoman Empire. It was a deliberate attempt at mass extermination, removing the Armenian Christians from Anatolia, which is that big landmass that we now think of as the Republic of Turkey, Asia Minor. But actually, even fewer people know that the Armenian genocide occurred within the context of a larger religious cleansing that began as early as 1912 and culminated with the burning of Smyrna in 1922. And it was an attempt by the Ottoman elite, especially the military elite and the government elite, to eliminate the Christian population from Turkey, from the core of the empire. There was an attempt to create a Turkey for the Turks, so-called, and the measure of Turkishness was the Islamic faith. And there was no room for Christians any longer, beginning at about 1912 in Turkey. And so this campaign of expulsion and slaughter was begun. Before it was over, 3 million Christians were killed, and these were Greeks, Armenians, and Assyrians.
Well, and I think you would obviously agree, and I think everybody right now, as soon as they hear you say this, say, what a parallel, because here you have in Turkey, under the Ottoman Empire, a desire to have Turkey for the Turks, and really it was this kind of virulent Muslim identity that was part of that. And what I would think you would see a lot of similarity today with this idea of a holy war or a jihad of radical Islam and ISIS and the slaughtering of Christians there once again in the Middle East.
Yeah, there are important parallels. In fact, the word jihad was thrown about quite a bit in those years, a century ago, just as as it is now. It was Muslims killing Christians. The Ottoman Empire was a theocracy. It was a religious state governed by the Sultan, and the Sultan was Muhammad's representative on earth. And he was a caliph, head of the Islamic faith on earth. And so he had this power to declare jihad. So that's a word that occurs, throughout this period. As I say, the measure of one's ability to survive was basically being a Muslim. If a Christian converted to the Islamic faith, he or she was likely to survive. But if one insisted on one's faith, Christianity, it was not a safe place to be.
Well, again, just a striking set of parallels. And we talked about the 3 million Christians who were killed, but isn't it also possible, and maybe we're jumping ahead in the story, but I thought I'd give people some of the punchline here. The Reverend Asa Jennings, he may have saved 1 million lives. Isn't that at least theoretically possible?
That's correct. He began by doing good work in Smyrna at a time of tremendous suffering, and the work that he did continued to escalate. And his first rescue was 2,000 people. And as you say, we're jumping ahead here a little bit, but he ultimately saved 250,000 people, unbelievably, from the city of Smyrna. And then after Smyrna was burned and there was a slaughter, it was principally a Christian city, there was an effort to push all Christians out of Asia Minor, and there was a need for rescue all along the Mediterranean, the Sea of Marmara, and the Black Sea coast. And that work was completed in the middle of 1923, at which time the patriarch of the Orthodox faith in Constantinople credited Asa Jennings, the hero of my book, with saving the lives of 1 million people.
It's just incredible. A lot of people, if we were to say the name Oskar Schindler, because of Schindler's List now, would know of an individual that saved Jews. I'm hoping your book has that same impact of when people sometimes in the future hear the name Asa Jennings, they'll realize how an individual saved perhaps 1 million Christians. And so I know that's one of the reasons you wanted to write this book, because it's not a well-known piece of history, and yet it's a piece, especially I think our Christian listeners need to know about in light of, like I said, all the things happening right now in the Middle East.
I think you're absolutely right. I think of it as one of the great stories of an American hero, in this case, an American Christian hero, that people don't know about. I think everybody in this country should be aware of the legacy of Asa Jennings, and his story should be in our history books. It's been largely forgotten. Just a few people know about it in that part of the world. It's mostly unknown there as well. But he overcame tremendous personal obstacles and a huge set of international obstacles. It's just amazing what he was able to do. But he did put together a rescue at a time when hundreds of thousands of people faced death. And working with some others, but principally on his own initiative, he was able to evacuate from Smyrna alone 250,000, mostly women, children, and old men, from the city of Smyrna and take them to a Greek island, Lesbos, and from there they were eventually resettled. But it's quite an achievement, and it's an achievement I think we can all be proud of, looking back on what this American was able to accomplish.
Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll get into the details, tell you a little bit more about Asa Jennings and some of the health issues he had to overcome, and then, of course, some of the foreign policy and diplomatic issues he had to overcome, and then how he worked with a naval officer and saved so many individuals. It's a name you've probably never heard before. Maybe we can change a little of that with this interview today and also with this book. It is published by HarperCollins, The Great Fire, One American's Mission to Rescue Victims of the 20th Century's First Genocide. Matter of fact, the term genocide really in large part came about as a result of what happened to so many Armenians and Christians. So we'll talk about that with Lou Ureneck right after these important messages.
The Point of View Commentary with Kerby Anderson.
When Greece decided to default on its payment to the International Monetary Fund, there were all sorts of economic commentaries. As accurate as they were, they usually don't tell the whole story from a demographic perspective. Let me tell that story. Actually, I could say, let me retell that story. Some of my commentaries 5 years ago were predicting these events when you look at the fertility rate and the welfare state. The national fertility rate in Greece is 1.3 children per woman. Demographers point out that a country needs a fertility rate of 2.1 to replace its population. That used to be the fertility rate in the United States, which is now down to 1.8. No matter what policies you implement in Greece, you are faced with the demographic winter that has befallen the country. You can't provide generous government benefits when you have so many parents and grandparents who need to be supported by a smaller cohort of children. You end up with too few paying into the system while too many are taking from the system. Fertility is the only part of the problem. The generous Greek welfare state is another, which appears completely disconnected from reality. Columnist Mark Stein reminds us that originally in the Greek welfare system, you could retire at the age of 58. More than that, public sector workers often get off work at 2:30 p.m., which he says is like working 7 or 8 months out of a typical American work year. And the Greek system also pays well. Public sector workers receive 14 monthly payments. You know, when you begin to understand the demographics and finances behind the current Greek tragedy, it's easy to see why this country is facing so many problems. But we can't as a country say to ourselves, that's their problem, but it isn't our problem. Our fertility rate may be a little higher than theirs and our finances in much better shape than theirs, but it would be only a matter of time before we find our country in the same circumstances as Greece. All this could be just simply a preview of coming attractions. I'm Kerby Anderson, and that's my point of view.
You're listening to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Privileged to have with us today Professor Lou Ureneck, and he is professor of journalism at Boston University and also the author of this book, The Great Fire, One American's Mission to Rescue Victims of the 20th Century First Genocide. And long before we had the Holocaust that we talk about today, the Nazi Holocaust against the Jews, you had an Armenian Holocaust that lasted for many years, but this was in the middle of a broader one from 1912 to 1922, in which there were probably 3 million Christians slaughtered. And if you can't see the parallels to today, I'm not sure I can do any more to try to make those. It's pretty obvious to any of us. And at the same time, this is a story about one man with some very significant hurdles in front of him, being able to save so many. And so, again, you may know the name Oscar Schindler. I'm hoping after this interview you might know the name of Asa Jennings as well. Let's talk about him for a minute. A pastor, a Christian, an American, had tuberculosis, some diseases. He could have just very easily said, Lou, this is not my job because I am not a healthy man. But nevertheless, he was able to overcome some major obstacles, wasn't he?
Absolutely. You know, as a young man in his 20s, he suffered, as you say, from tuberculosis, suffered terribly, and then he caught something called Pott's disease, which is an extension of tuberculosis. It's an infection of the spine, and his spine literally collapsed. He lost 5 inches of height. He was in a full body cast for more than a year. He very nearly died. The doctors expected that he was going to die, and they had advised his wife that his time was limited. He had a very devoted wife, and together they read the Bible. There were several passages in particular that they read over and over again. It sustained them. She nursed him back to health, and he recovered in a sense. He didn't die, but he never fully recovered. Throughout his life, he had a lot of pain in his back. He had a crooked back, a kind of hump on his back, a crooked spine, and he suffered a fever nearly every day of his life. So he was a guy who had a lot of personal health issues. Nonetheless, and this is one of the appealing things about Reverend Jennings, he was a very cheerful person. He always had a smile. He liked to sing. He liked to tell a joke. He liked to laugh. He was very cheerful, and he was busy all the time. He liked to make himself useful. This is one of the aspects of his life that's so appealing. He wanted to be useful. And so wherever he found himself, whether it was working as a minister in upstate New York, he was born in Ontario, New York, on a farm, a family of Methodists, and he went to work eventually for the YMCA in Utica, New York. Then he went to France, where he worked with the Y, decommissioning soldiers, American soldiers from World War I. Then Czechoslovakia, which was a new country after World War I, and then ultimately Smyrna. And he was a kind of middle-level employee of the YMCA, which had a strong missionary impulse and a mission in those years. And his job actually was to organize boys of different faiths, Muslims, Jews, Christians, into sports teams and to teach them civic virtue and Christian habits and virtue and so forth. He arrived in Smyrna just before this catastrophe, late August 1922. The story at Smyrna really begins in the first week of September. So he's there. Everybody's on vacation, which they seem to do in that part of the world at the end of August. So he was there in the city when all of the trouble broke out. And he certainly found a way to be useful over the course of September 1922. He just did some incredible things.
Well, again, this is a city in Turkey, and of course, Smyrna is well known because of its biblical allusions as well. Not surprising, by the way, that a number of Christians went over there. This was a period of time when you had Christians in the United States in the 20s, well, even before that, but especially in the 1920s, going to China, going to Turkey, in mission groups and things like that. But then you find in the midst of this, a fire breaks out. Now, I know there's some debate as to whether or not the Turks said it. I think that's pretty obvious. But nevertheless, we'll leave that as it is. And now you have a real challenge because these sections of this town are burning. They're going to the waterfront in order to escape being killed. But now you've got the conflict then. So I'll let you kind of finish the story because it's an important one to begin to see how he very quickly, with kind of an enterprising mindset, was able to turn this tragedy into some kind of rescue.
Right. First a word about Smyrna. As you say, Smyrna has important biblical antecedents, and it was the place that first accepted American missionaries in the early 19th century. It was a very prosperous city by virtue of the tobacco trade and dried fruit and oriental carpets and so forth. Many fortunes were made at Smyrna. And there was an important American colony there, both missionaries and business people. It was a majority Christian city. In that sense, it was an exception. It was inside the Ottoman Empire, but it had more Christians than Muslims. It actually had more Greeks than the city of Athens. It was a very tolerant, kind of sophisticated, wealthy place where people of different faiths more or less got along. Well, all of that changed in early September of 1922. The Turkish Nationalist Army entered the city on September 9. Very soon the army lost its discipline. There was no effort on the part of the officers to stop what would become a slaughter. Soldiers at first began looting the Armenian quarter, pulling, goods and things out of stores and out of people's homes, and it very quickly turned into rape and into murder. It was just a horrible scene, and in a matter of days, the entire city of Smyrna was a scene of rape and pillage and murder. There was no place for a Christian to be safe in the city of Smyrna. Making matters even worse was this. Ahead of the Turkish army, the interior behind the eastern section of the country, sort of behind Smyrna, that part of Turkey, there were many Christian farmers and villages. They fled ahead of the Turkish army into the city of Smyrna, thinking that they would be safe at Smyrna, safe from the Turkish army. They thought this largely because the great powers, including the United States, had naval ships there. So at the time of the Turkish army's entry into the city of Smyrna on September 9, there were 300,000 refugees. This is in addition to a population of 500,000 people. These people were sleeping in the streets, railroad stations, churchyards, cemeteries, wherever they could find a place to put down a blanket and make a little space for their children and their personal goods. So they also were the victims of this generalized slaughter over the city of Smyrna. And then, as you say, very tragically, on Wednesday, September 13, the Turkish army set the city, well, actually it set the Armenian quarter on fire. There were 4 fires that were set around the Armenian quarter. We don't know why they set the fire. There's some pretty good theories, but we do know that they did set it because we have so many American witnesses to the arson. These were school teachers and principals and doctors and naval officers and so forth, people who really, in a sense, we could say were objective about what was happening at Smyrna. They saw the Turkish soldiers setting fire to the homes. A strong wind came up out of the south, unusual for that part of the world in the summer, and drove the fire generally across the city. So we had this situation where hundreds of thousands of people were driven, hate to say it, but like animals ahead of a forest fire, they were driven toward the waterfront. Now, the way Smyrna lays on the harbor, there's a long promenade, almost 2 miles long. It's kind of a narrow cobblestone promenade that's called the K. And in better times, it was a very fashionable place to walk in the evening, to meet neighbors, to enjoy oneself, and so forth. And there were hotels and restaurants and private clubs and mansions and so forth along this K. Well, on the night of Wednesday, September 13, hundreds of thousands of people are driven ahead of the fire down to the K, and they're trapped in this narrow space. Let's say it's maybe 40 or 50 feet wide, almost 2 miles long, a whole city worth of people.
I might just say, too, you got a picture of that in your book. And if you can imagine just a small space before you get to the water, and it's just wall-to-wall people, it just gives you an idea. We need to go to a break anyway, so let me come back and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But it seems almost impossible that many people could be fit into that small space called the K. But we'll come back and finish the story off and tell you a little bit more about an individual who, because of his faithfulness and because of his entrepreneurship and enterprising mindset, was able to save so many, Asa Jennings. So this is all part of a book that we are talking about today, The Great Fire, One American's Mission to Rescue Victims of the 20th Century's First Genocide. We've talked a little bit about the Armenian Holocaust. Maybe you've learned a little bit about that. When we come back, we'll learn a little bit more about what one individual did to save so many lives. We'll continue our conversation with Lou Ureneck, and we're going to go to a break. But as we do so, visit our website, pointofview.net. We have some of the information about the conversation we're having, as well as some of our action items. So let's take a break. We'll continue our story right after these important messages.
There is a big incentive to pay your electric bill. If you don't, you find yourself in the dark. But who pays to make sure you're educated on the key issues of the day, to bring you wisdom for life at work, at home, and in the culture, like you hear from guests here on Point of View? Who makes sure that our electric bill gets paid? You're way ahead of me, aren't you? That's right. You do. The truth is, if every listener this week gave just $5, we could pay our bills for about the next 3 years. Did you hear me? $5, 3 years. Now, perhaps you can give more. How about $50 or $500, maybe even more? But please, don't be the one who fails to send at least $5. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Whatever amount you chip in, thank you for your gift. Point of View will continue after this.
You are listening to Point of View. The opinions expressed on Point of View do not necessarily reflect the views of the management or staff of this station. And now, here again is Kerby Anderson.
Back for a few more minutes as we talk with Professor Lou Ureneck, and his book is entitled The Great Fire, One American's Mission to Rescue Victims of the 20th Century's First Genocide. And if you'd like to join us, 1-800-351-1212. Lou, we left our people stranded at the waterfront there. We don't want to leave them there too long, but it's a good illustration of how very quickly this situation got to a point of tremendous tragedy. And there is where I think we can begin to bring in some of the innovative ideas that came from Reverend Asa Jennings.
That's right. You know, as you say, the waterfront was densely packed with people, hundreds of thousands of people caught between this very hot fire and the water. the fire was so hot that the ships in the harbor literally had to raise their anchors and drop further back because the canvas tarpaulins and the lines on their ships were catching fire. The people, many of them had brought, they were poor farmers. They had brought their animals into the city. These animals had packs on their backs. Those packs caught fire by virtue of the heat,
yes,
and the animals were stampeding back and forth. So it was an absolutely hellish scene. Before the fire had broken out, Asa Jennings had occupied a series of vacant mansions along the K. The owners had departed when they had heard the Turkish army was about to enter the city. So he took them and he used these homes as safe houses for women who had been raped by Turkish soldiers. Rape was a weapon of war, and beginning on September 9, soon after the army had entered, thousands of women were raped. They were badly injured, traumatized. Jennings put them into these safe houses where he gave them what medical care he could. He was running these safe houses when the fire broke out, and he actually stayed on shore in the city as the fire raced through the city. Others who would remain in the city got on ships and watched it safely from the decks of various vessels and then later went back ashore. But Jennings stayed on the shore as the fire burned. The fire burned for 3.5 days, and about 90% of the city was destroyed. This big, beautiful city was now, a smoldering ruins. The fire was so hot it had melted the water pipes. There was very little food available. Most of that went to the Turkish army. Sanitary conditions were awful, so disease broke out. So we had a situation where hundreds of thousands of people were literally stranded and were dying from starvation, disease, thirst, and from actual slaughter by swords and guns and bayonets, and just terrible and horribly. The great powers, so-called, Britain, France, the United States, each for its own kind of selfish reason, emanating from their capitals and other countries, they chose not to get involved.
Yeah, they just turned their back really on the Holocaust that happened before, and then on what happened in Smyrna. Go ahead.
Yeah, it's not a proud moment for any of those governments. But Jennings and a small group of Americans had formed a relief committee. They were the only national group to do so, and they were doing what they could. And Jennings, of course, did the safe houses. After the fire, it was a hopeless situation. There was a lot of death. There was no way to get people out of the city. Ships wouldn't come into Smyrna because of the disease, and there was no money to be made in carrying away refugees. Absolutely hopeless. Well, the story shifts amazingly on September 20. It happened to be Jennings' 45th birthday. He was outside one of the safe houses, and he saw distantly in the harbor an Italian freighter. And he thought, if I can get some people on that freighter, maybe somehow I can rescue some of these people, these women under my care. He went to the senior naval officer, the American senior naval officer in the city. His name was Halsey Powell. He becomes very important to the story. Halsey Powell was a young man from a little town in Kentucky, McAfee, Kentucky. And he was a World War I naval hero and just an exceptional individual. Jennings asked him for a boat and a sailor to get out to the Italian freighter. Halsey Powell, who was really under orders not to get involved in any of this. He was there to protect American property and American citizens, but he consented. And Jennings
he was a Christian too, wasn't he?
He very much so. He was raised in a Christian household. His family was very proud of that upbringing in Harrodsburg, and I have in the book some really interesting letters from various relatives about Halsey as a young man. He went to Center College, which is a Presbyterian college in Kentucky, before transferring to the Naval Academy. So Jennings gets out to the Italian freighter and parlays with this ship captain, pays him a bribe, and manages to get him to take 2,000 people aboard the ship. And Halsey Powell, again, skirting the very edge of maybe even breaking the orders that he was given, gets these people out to this ship. And they take 2,000. It's a drop in the bucket, but it's human life, and they're getting people out of there. They take them to the island of Lesbos, a Greek island nearby. Jennings gets there and middle of the night unloads these people, and he sees at anchor a lot of empty Greek merchant ships that had been used as troop ships by the Greek army. And he thinks to himself, actually quite incredibly, if I could somehow get a hold of these ships, get possession of them, sort of the way he got possession of the mansions,
yes,
and if I could somehow, bring them into the city of Smyrna, to the harbor, which seemed fantastic given that Greece and Turkey were at war. They were, just enemies. And then he thinks further, if there's somehow I can get these people onto the ships, I can save a lot of lives. Well, I tell the story in some detail in the book, but let's just say that, faced with the prospect of so much death, he did what he had to do. He told a few lies. He sort of overstated his portfolio. He even went so far as to, I would say, extort a foreign government. And he did all of this, quite incredibly from the bridge of a Greek battleship that was there docked at Lesbos, and he had the cooperation of I would even say the co-conspirator, a Greek battleship captain. And Jennings managed to get possession of 50 ships. It's just amazing. So through this period, he's communicating with Halsey Powell back at Smyrna through the Greek battleship. And Powell goes to work with the Turks, and he managed to negotiate an opportunity to bring ships in quickly if they're unflagged, if they're not representing any particular nation. And he also, quite amazingly, again, he's going beyond the orders that he was given by his boss. He promises to escort the Greek ships, unflagged Greek ships with American destroyers, show of American naval force. So, one thing leads to another, and it's quite a story. But in the end, Jennings is on the bridge of a Greek ship, leading a line of Greek ships, which is following an American destroyer into Smyrna Harbor. Hundreds of thousands of people see this, and they realize we will be rescued. This giant cheer goes up from the city. The Turkish army had given Jennings and Powell 7 days to remove all of the people. Of course, that was an impossibility. It was just too many people, and the logistics were not there. The men, by the way, were being marched out of the city and executed. They were only allowed to remove women, children, and old men. But somehow, incredibly, I mean, it's miracle perhaps is not too strong a word in this context. Powell and Jennings managed to load 250,000 people on these ships over the course of 7 days. They were shuttling the ships back and forth between Smyrna and Mytilene, and by the end of September, they met the deadline, and they had all of the Christians out of the city of Smyrna. It is quite a tale, and it's one that I think that Americans can be proud of. They ought to be aware of. It's a great naval story. It's the great story of a Christian living his faith and putting it into practice. There are literally millions of people alive today as a consequence of the actions of Asa Jennings.
Wow. Incredible story, and I wanted to let people know about that. Again, the book is available probably in your local bookstore, and it's a HarperCollins. And Professor Lou Ureneck, I appreciate you telling the story, and I guess the only question left is when they're going to make a Hollywood movie about this.
Well, I hope you're right. I will say, if people would like to look at some pictures and learn a little bit more about the characters, in addition to your website, they can go to Smyrna Fire, Smyrna, SmyrnaFire.com, and they can learn some more about this amazing story.
We do have a link to it. It's Smyrna Fire, in case you don't have to spell Smyrna's with a Y. But again, we have a link to that as well, and it's the forgotten true story of an American rescue. We have that link on our website, pointofview.net. And, of course, we have more information about the book and a place for you to order it if you'd like to do so. And, of course, look for it in your local bookstore. And if it's not there, we've made it easy for you to find it. So, Professor Lou Ureneck, it was great to have you on the program. Let's do it again sometime.
Thank you for having me.
We're going to take a break. When we come back, I got a couple other stories real quickly to cover before this day is over, because there are certainly lots of things happening, but wanted you to know a little bit more about an untold story that deserved telling. And so that's why we took some time today to tell you about that. The word genocide actually was developed after the Armenian genocide. And so today we take for granted that. And of course, the Armenian Holocaust was also part of it. Again, attacks on Christians back then, we see it happening in our world today. We'll be right back.
Now, back to Point of View, your listener-supported source for truth.
Back for a few more minutes. Just wanted to give you kind of a preview of what we're going to talk about tomorrow, because we're going to go into some depth on a couple of really important issues that sometimes get set on the back burner but are deserving of a lot more attention. So we're going to take some time in the first hour tomorrow to really get into those. One of those has to do with the issue of abortion. You might remember about a week or two ago, we had people calling in saying, well, the Supreme Court struck down the decision that was actually rendered before by the Fifth Circuit Court and by the actions of the Texas legislature. They really did not. Actually, what they did was decide to temporarily halt the enforcement of part of the law that was passed in Texas, which would actually require that abortion facilities have the same health and safety standards of any other kind of outpatient clinic. Well, I'm going to get into this in a little more detail tomorrow, because the argument that was made by Planned Parenthood is that the law would force most of the 19 abortion clinics left. Now, recognize a number of them already closed down because of the first part of that law, but it would have required many of the others to close down, and that was an argument that this was unacceptable to women's health. One of the pieces I'm going to talk about tomorrow by Denise Burke points out the kind of the hypocrisy of all that, because you can see that when you've had these regulations that have been implemented, it doesn't cause women who really are eager to get an abortion not to get one. They just might have to go to a little more trouble. And she uses an example. Back in 2012 in New Hampshire, they enacted a law requiring an abortion provider notify a parent or a guardian at least 48 hours before a minor's planned abortion. Well, that requirement in New Hampshire caused Planned Parenthood to pick up its abortion clinic in Lebanon, New Hampshire, and move it to White River Junction, Vermont, because Vermont does not have a parental involvement law. Well, no one at the time complained about this was causing some kind of distress or was providing some kind of major barrier. And so we're going to spend some time tomorrow talking about this, because the argument being made right now is that even though this case will now go before the Supreme Court, it may not be a case that the abortion industry really wants to go before the Supreme Court, because they're going to find themselves having to argue that under-regulated or even non-regulated abortion clinics are okay with them. And that is going to, I think, be a real issue. So we're going to get into that in some detail tomorrow. And also, now that these regulations have been issued by the Obama administration having to deal with what's called the Fair Housing Rule, this has the potential of being one of the most significant actions taken by this administration and will affect so many individuals. As a matter of fact, Stanley Kurtz, who has written a book called Spreading the Wealth, How Obama is Robbing the Suburbs to Pay for the Cities. We've talked a little bit about this before, but now that the regulations have been issued by Julian Castro, who is the HUD secretary, this, in a sense, gives the federal government tremendous oversight over various areas, including suburbs. And an example that some people have been using is, for those of us a little bit older, remembering forced busing, how that was used to try to get, for example, African-American kids and put them in white schools, and Anglo-American kids put them in black schools and all of that. This is much more significant, because now this gives authority to the federal government in ways that are completely unprecedented. And this is another very significant power grab, but it also is coming out, I think, to become an election year issue, because as soon as I think Americans begin to understand what this entails, oh my goodness, there are going to be so many people complaining, and I think this is going to be used then as a way to maybe make it a campaign issue. And Julian Castro, however you want to pronounce his name, most people think he might be the vice presidential nominee if indeed Hillary Clinton becomes the presidential nominee on the Democratic side. So he's at the kind of the forefront of some of this. And so we're going to spend a little bit of time talking about how a decision made by Housing and Urban Development could affect you and your neighborhood in ways that are almost unprecedented. Just before we run out of time, let me mention that we do post my commentary every day. And if you don't receive my commentary, there's a place for you to sign up, and we like to send it to your inbox. You can also watch it or listen to it as well. But the one today has to do with Greece, and that has certainly been in the news. And as I've pointed out before, Greece has a lot of problems, but some of those have to do with both demographics as well as government policies. For example, I've pointed out that the fertility rate in Greece is about 1.3 children per woman. Demographers tell us that we need about 2.1 children to replace its population, and yet this fertility rate is much, much lower. So as I point out in my commentary, no matter what policies you implement in Greece, you're faced with a demographic winter that has befallen the country. You cannot have a generous welfare system when, in some cases, in some communities, you actually have more grandparents than parents, more parents than you have kids. It doesn't work because what you need are a very large cohort of children to support the parents and grandparents. You have right now a situation where you have too few paying into the system and you have too many taking out of the system. But that's only part of it because, as I mentioned, you have a very generous welfare system that you've had in Greece for many years. And we've had Mark Stein on the program talking about that. You could, in the Greek welfare system when it used to exist, retire at the age of 58. Oftentimes, public sector workers get off at 2:30 in the afternoon. And Mark Stein says that's kind of like having a 7 or 8 month work year, which is pretty amazing. And the public sector workers receive 14 monthly payments. I thought we only had 12 months in a year. They get 14. They get extra bonuses. And so you can begin to see that whether you look at the demographics or the policies, Greek is facing some very significant issues. Which brings us back to some of the deals that have been made in the last couple of weeks, and even one announced over the weekend, solve the problem just for a very short period of time. But the bigger problem has to do with the fact that there is a collapsing of the populations in most of Europe. And so when you look at Greece, you recognize that it looks a lot like Spain and Portugal. And certainly we have talked about some of the other countries like France and Germany and others, and all of them have declining populations at the very same time when they have very generous health care benefits, welfare benefits, and the rest. And so I think that this problem is going to exist for some time and probably will get a lot worse. There's a lesson to be learned here in America. We used to have a fertility rate of 2.1. Now it's 1.8. And so if we don't turn some things around in terms of our own demographics and in terms of our own finances, after all, we owe $18 trillion in debt, we will find ourselves in the very same situation. That's why I think it is absolutely crucial that you pay attention to who's running for office, what policies he or she are proposing, and whether or not they're going to actually address these problems or whether they're going to simply ignore these problems and eventually find ourselves looking a lot like Greece. You don't want to go to Greece right now because you can only get about $60 out of an ATM machine. That's assuming there's even cash in the ATM machine in the first place. Let's hope we never see anything like that here in the United States. Well, that's all we have for today. Tomorrow we're going to spend some time getting into some of these policies that you haven't heard about but are going to affect you and your family, and that's why we cover these very important issues every single day here on Point of View. If you'd like to know a little bit more about Laurie Cardoza-Moore or about the book by Lou Ureneck, those informational pieces are on our website. Just click the button that says See More, and you'll have a lot more opportunity to read about those and to take some action in your community. One last time, we're also encouraging those of you that maybe have never given. Could you spare $5 just once? That would be a great encouragement to us, and we have an opportunity for you to click a button and sow some of those seeds and make a difference. I want to thank Abby and Andrew and Catherine and Chris for the help behind the scenes. Have a great day, and we'll see you back here tomorrow.
If you've been a Christian for any length of time, no doubt you've heard about Jesus feeding thousands with a few loaves of bread and a couple of fish. Jesus took something small and turned it into something big. Recently, someone here at Point of View made an interesting discovery. He did some math and figured out that according to the number of faithful listeners we have, if you and every other listener gave $5, it would help Kerby and the team bring you interviews and commentary for not 3 months, but 3 years. You heard me right. If every listener donates just $5, we'd pay what it costs to bring you this needed information for 3 years. And if you urge a friend to join you, you send 5, they send 5, well, you can imagine the impact. Click the Donate Now button at pointofview.net, pointofview.net, or send $5 to Point of View, Box 30, Dallas, Texas 75221. Box 30, Dallas 75221. Send $5. Urge a friend to join you. Support Point of View. Point of View is produced by Point of View Ministries.